Good morning to all of you. Welcome to Brookings for this event on Indian Prime Minister Modi's upcoming visits to the US and Israel, which we're co-hosting as the India Project with our Center for Middle East Policy. I'm Tanvi Madan. I'm director of the India Project and a fellow in the Foreign Policy Program. This first panel here will discuss the first trip that Modi will be taking ahead of his trip to Israel. This is his trip to Washington on June 25th and June 26th. And it will be his first face-to-face meeting with President Trump. They have spoken on the phone 3 times, but this will be their first face-to-face meeting. 3 years ago, when Prime Minister Modi first came to the US as Prime Minister, that was his first trip as Prime Minister he had been before, American policymakers saw it as an opportunity to engage with the leader of a strategically important country. Given the limited official engagement with him before he took office, however, there was much uncertainty about the approach he would take towards the US and uncertainty about him in general. Today, it is now Prime Minister Modi's turn to engage a new US president with whom there's been limited interaction and about whom there remain many uncertainties. His upcoming visit will be his 5th to Washington, to the US as PM, his 4th to Washington. And it will be, as you all know, a very different Washington that he comes to than he did a year ago this month. What have been the drivers of this US-India relationship that he has been developing and doubling down on over the last 3 years that he has been Prime Minister? And we'll discuss this from both the US and Indian perspectives. How might the terms of engagement change under President Trump? And where do defense and economic relations stand, and what might we expect from this upcoming visit? These are some of the questions we'll discuss and more with the great panel that we have today. On my left, Ambassador Nirupma Rao, who has been Indian Foreign Secretary, as well as India's ambassador to the US and China. She's now a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center for the summer. To my right, Jamie Fly, who is back in think tank world now as a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the US, and previously was Counselor for Foreign and National Security Affairs to Senator Marco Rubio from 2013 to 2017. To my further right is Joshua White, Associate Professor of the Practice of South Asia Studies at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Josh was Senior Advisor and Director for South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council in the Obama administration. And finally, to my further left is Richard Rosso, who holds the Wadhwani Chair of US-India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and has been for a number of years, almost 2 decades, working on, among other things, kind of the US-India business and economic relations. We'll start this discussion with Ambassador Rao, who will be giving us an Indian perspective of where the US fits into Indian strategy and what Prime Minister Modi will be looking for from this visit. Ambassador Rao.
Thank you, Tanvi, and it's a privilege to be here at Brookings and to share this panel with so many distinguished experts. Thank you. So the questions you asked were where the US fits into the Indian government's strategy on the eve of the Modi visit to Washington. Obviously, that's a very relevant question. And a related question is what Mr. Modi will be looking to get out of this visit. The second question obviously flows from the pointers established in the answers to the first. Now, the Modi government clearly references its US relationship on the basis of all the highs achieved over the years since 2014, particularly. Good leadership level chemistry with the previous president, an enhanced defense partnership, clean energy cooperation, high profile military exercises, maritime cooperation in the Indian Ocean, pivoting, that's on the part of the US pivoting to India as against China, the great emotional highs involving interactions with the Indian diaspora during Modi's previous visits, and the bonhomie with the likes of Mark Zuckerberg or Sundar Pichai. The conjunction of the stars seemed just right for this relationship. Now, this new best friend relationship was important and vital in many ways for its enhanced security component, the openings it provided for access to high technology, a field denied, as you know, to India in past decades of estrangement, and innovation, counterterrorism cooperation, and information sharing, the natural partnership patterns developed to counter China's growing influence in the Indian Ocean and the Asia-Pacific, involving a cooperative network of like-minded democracies like Japan, India, and the United States, the de-hyphenation with Pakistan, and the recognition of India as a paramount force for stability, economic growth, and development in South Asia. What the Trump administration inherits, therefore, is a relationship in a good state of health and many visible signs of mutual confidence and comfort, quite different from the past. Now, there is not much to suggest, in my view, that the new president has the intention to venture forth on a course correction where relations with India are concerned. There obviously is no need for that. In a fundamental sense, the outlook on India is positive, even if Mr. Trump's remarks on India in the context of the climate agreement, which the US has quit, may have caused some consternation, or for that matter, the whole issue of H-1B visas and quotas for skilled information technology industry workers, a matter that is monitored with some anxiety in India. I believe it will be Prime Minister Modi's focus during this visit to establish a good chemistry and a cordial understanding with President Trump, one that reassures the latter that India is a reliable and dependable partner democracy of the United States, a pivotal state that can work together with the US for the advancement of common strategic interests in Asia and the Indian Ocean, that making America great again is not at all in dissonance with India's rise. In fact, it should be Mr. Modi's refrain that US investment in India's modernization is good for making America great again mission, because India's economic growth and political and strategic influence as a natural partner of the United States in the world reinforces American resurgence. The visit should also provide an opportunity for the two leaders to discuss their vision and strategic direction for this relationship over the next decade and its place in the global arena. Growing defense cooperation and the supply side of this relationship involving equipment purchases, as also joint research and co-production, can help generate jobs for American workers. There is scope also for intensified dialogue between military establishments and training commands in both countries, as also putting in place technical provisions for better interoperability in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, counter-piracy, and freedom of navigation operations. Now, Indian willingness to share burdens of security to the extent of our capabilities that will augment support for US stature and influence in the region of the Asia-Pacific, Afghanistan, and the Gulf will also help address issues of trust and confidence that may be raised by an administration that is more transactional in its approach than its predecessors. Transactionalism in itself need not be dismissed pejoratively. Every country looks out for its interests. There are no free lunches in international relations. Today especially, I think we note that. India subconsciously also does not want its good deeds to go unrequited. Perhaps US endorsement and support for India's entry into the APEC could be a very positive signal to the Indian body politic as an indicator of President Trump's positive India outlook. And even though US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement may cast a long shadow on clean energy cooperation projects in the bilateral field, a factor that could in a real sense be addressed, as it's been said elsewhere, by stronger cooperation at the state-to-state, I mean between US states and Indian states, university and business-to-business level cooperation between both countries, Indian willingness to buy more shale gas from the US will benefit the US economy. This is in the field of energy cooperation. Reduce imbalances in bilateral trade and help with more jobs for US workers, besides augmenting India's energy security. I think it's also important that this not become the mother of visits. I'm talking of the Modi visit. For this relationship, it's essential that both governments establish a smooth transition to this next phase where levels of mutual trust and confidence and strategic convergence are increased, and there is an established momentum and sequence of high-level dialogue, including a Trump visit to India without too long a delay. I think the Prime Minister's visit would be a success if it firstly establishes a smooth, unaffected communication and chemistry between him and the President, if there is a stated willingness by the new administration to build upon the strategic partnership with India, particularly in defense and security, counterterrorism, and in the maritime domain. Likewise, in trade, technology, and investment, an emphasis on building ties of mutual benefit in order to help each other equitably will also be a measure of success. A statement of intent to work more closely together in Afghanistan, as also Indian willingness for some burden sharing to advance stability in the crucial Gulf region, would strike a positive note. A joint statement is expected from this visit. It will no doubt be mined and dissected for many hidden meanings. But much more than this, if Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump are able to establish a good comfort level with each other, the gods are bound to smile. Ultimately, this is a relationship with many anchors that provide ballast and stability. Congressional ties and continuing support from Congress for new bilateral initiatives, trade, investment, and business ties, ties between research and educational institutions, state-to-state ties, as I mentioned, between the provinces, the Indian-American community, and the mutually compatible nature of two vibrant democracies make for a solid relationship that is resilient and exuberant. Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump have much to celebrate, grow, and progress in the ties between our two democracies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rao. Jamie, President Trump is no stranger to India and vice versa. He has been to the country, has spoken about it, even during the campaign went out and gave a campaign speech to Indian Americans. But we don't know much about what he thinks about it in a policy sense. Give us a sense of how the US-India relationship more broadly has been seen from a US perspective, and how you think the Trump administration should approach it over the next few years.
Well, thanks. Thanks for putting this panel together, and thanks for including me on it. I kind of feel like the interloper here, the kind of non-India expert on the panel, certainly a proponent of US-India relations, and someone who, in my previous think tank work and also then in Congress, did everything I could to try to deepen US-India ties. I agree with everything the ambassador said. I think that this is a relationship that the Trump administration is inheriting. It's in very good shape, that successive administrations now have deepened the already close ties between our two countries. I don't want to run the risk of building up this visit into too much or treating it as the mother of all visits, as the ambassador said, because I do think there's a danger in that. However, I'm going to be watching how things go with the visit very closely, also to get a better sense of where this administration wants to go with its broader strategic policy. I think we've had a succession of foreign leaders now that the president has interacted with. You can put them into different categories, allies that the president needs to manage those relationships. You've had countries where the United States wants to deepen ties with, and often there's a lot of talk about economic engagement. I haven't really seen this administration yet, though, meet with partners and look at some of these relationships from a longer-term strategic perspective. I think the one danger that this administration faces, given the chaos and uncertainty in many parts of the world, is just getting sucked into crisis management, responding to the latest headline, the latest problem overseas. The great thing about the U.S.-India relationship is if the administration wants to invest the time and energy, this can be a long-term success story for this administration. It can be something where if they handle it effectively and capably and build on all the good work that's already been done, where I really think they could leave their mark on a relationship that I think is going to define U.S. role in the world over the coming decades. Obviously, this is because of, in large part because of the general importance of Asia to our security in the future, because of the rise of China, as India also rises and expands its economy. And so that's the main thing I'm going to be watching for is, do they just treat this as another foreign leader visit? They need to announce some investments, some job creation, or are they laying the groundwork for a real deepening of ties and taking this relationship to the next level? I think there are a lot of positive aspects that we'll probably see mentioned and discussed, and I'll briefly discuss a few potential pitfalls. Obviously, on the positive side, the defense relationship is booming. The number of exercises that the two countries are doing together has been steadily increasing. There's a lot of potential area for even deepening that cooperation further, additional defense articles that can be sold. I'm sure we'll hear about more of that down the road. I think it's important to continue to expand our cooperation in those areas because obviously the threats that both countries face continue to evolve. We don't even have to just look at it through the rise of China and China's changing strategic posture in the region. If you look at the threat of terrorism that India also needs to be concerned about, the instability in the Middle East. Iran's, although there are obviously differences in terms of how the two countries see the Iran threat, but Iran's continuing belligerence. These are all things that I think we need to discuss as partners and try to find ways to continue to deepen our ties to deal with those challenges. On a number of diplomatic issues, I think there are also a lot of positive developments that we've seen. The traditional concern that India has had about U.S. intentions in Afghanistan, I would assume, at least for now, will be somewhat satisfied by the fact that this administration has already decided that they are going to increase our troop commitment in Afghanistan, that there's no intention of the U.S. abandoning Afghanistan anytime soon. And at least what we've seen from press reports seems to indicate as part of that development of an Afghan strategy, there's an interest in this administration in taking a tougher approach towards Pakistan, which is something I don't think we've seen really play out in the past, even as the U.S. at various times has reviewed its strategy in Afghanistan. The thing I'm a big proponent of in this area is I think there's a danger that our U.S.-India dialogue often falls into just the traditional channels through the State Department South Asia Bureau or the people at the NSC who work on South Asia, and I think there's a real opportunity, which at various times has been tried in the past, but I think it should be regularized, of establishing dialogues on all of these issues, East Asia, Middle East, through the respective bureaus and getting those people together with their counterparts in the Indian government on a regular basis to discuss these issues, like we do, quite frankly, with many of our allies in East Asia, Japan, Australia, and others. On the trade front, I think there are opportunities. I think it is a big question mark for me, though, just given the uncertainty about this administration's broader trade agenda. I think if this administration decided that it wanted to devote the time and energy, we could make some progress in U.S.-India trade talks, perhaps with a bit. I'm a bit concerned, though, given the fact that we are now focused on bilateral trade negotiations and The reality is, and I've heard this all around the world as I've certainly traveled as a Senate staffer, there are many countries that for years have been lining up to engage in bilateral trade talks with the U.S., and the reality is our USTR never has enough resources, never has enough staff. Even when they were negotiating large multilateral agreements, obviously India would have to be a very high priority and at the top of the list. But my guess is that this is going to be something that's going to just take a little bit of time as the administration develops its broader trade strategy. One other area related to trade and economic engagement that I think the administration should explore is how the U.S. and India can work together given what China is pursuing with One Belt, One Road. This is obviously very key to India's broader neighborhood relations. A lot of its neighbors are engaging with China in this process. I think the administration has also not completely developed its approach to One Belt, One Road, and this is an area where I think it would be in both the U.S. and India's interest to see how we can engage in South and Southeast Asia, perhaps together, as we figure out how to direct our investment, our foreign assistance, various foreign assistance programs. And so that's something that I hope will be on the agenda. And one final point related to kind of trade and economic engagement. My understanding is that certainly business engagement has increased. The number of Americans traveling to India is on the rise and vice versa. The one thing that I've been concerned about, though, and it's probably even more relevant working for a place like German Marshall Fund at this point, a lot of our strong partnerships in the past have been built on the foundation of fellowship programs, exchange programs. And it's one area, as I've worked in D.C. now for several decades, where I've been struck how many Americans who are in key positions in Capitol Hill, in the executive branch, have never traveled to India. It became a rite of passage for most young Americans working on foreign policy to go on a U.S.-German exchange program or to join with another European partner in one of these programs. And that creates a lot of goodwill. It creates connections that people then end up using decades later. And that's one area where I do think we're lacking. I'm not sure that this is an area where necessarily the government needs to step in and create these sorts of programs, but it's something that I think people in the companies in the private sector and other individuals who care about the U.S.-India relationship should be focused on. Just very quickly on potential pitfalls, because I think most of them were already covered by the ambassador. You obviously have the concerns about the Paris Climate Agreement decision by President Trump, the H-1B issue, which I would just caution my friends in the administration. The last time I was in India about 2 or 3 months ago, I was struck by how important this issue is to our Indian partners and to the broader public discussion about the relationship. Obviously, the H-1B issue is a thorny one. There are probably some reforms that need to be done to the program to ensure that it's not being abused. I think Congress can play a role there with some of the various initiatives that certain members of Congress have introduced. But I hope that this is not an issue that dominates this first meeting. I think that's something that should be worked out behind the scenes, and hopefully some middle ground can be found. The big strategic issue, though, that I worry about as a potential pitfall is the U.S.-China relationship. And perhaps we've already reached a pivot moment in this administration's thinking on China. I've been struck by the president's dealings with Xi Jinping. Certainly North Korea has changed the campaign focus of this president, which was very obviously anti-China, certainly on trade. I had hoped, and I think many others had hoped, that this might be an administration that would be very clear-eyed about the China challenge and building on the good work of the rebalance that the previous administration did. My fear is that some of that has been put off for now because of this singular focus on getting Chinese cooperation on North Korea. Now that I think maybe the president is starting to realize that the Chinese are not going to deliver on that, maybe we'll revert to more of his campaign posture on China. But there is a danger, I think, if we are seeing this sort of G2 approach where the U.S. and China are going to solve many challenges together, where there's going to be a lot of focus on economic cooperation with China. I do worry that over the long run may limit the potential that this administration has to deepen ties with India. And I can say from my trip to India a few months ago, I think even that was right before the Mar-a-Lago summit, but I've heard since the Mar-a-Lago summit there's a lot of concern about what exactly this administration's approach to China is, because this is an area where I've been struck as I've traveled to India over the last several years, that this is an area where the Indian debate is evolving significantly, and there's a much more, I think, willingness to speak very frankly about the challenges that China poses to certainly India's security in the long run. So just to close, I think the big question is this going to be just a tending of a already close relationship, or is this going to be the relationship that the administration kind of grabs onto and runs with as a real strategic opportunity, an opportunity to put their mark on American strategy in Asia? And I think it's how they answer that question is going to be incredibly important, given all of the factors that we see in that region that are going to affect our security in the decades to come, both of our countries' securities in the decades to come.
Thank you, Jamie. Josh, you worked for an administration that did put a lot of time and energy into the relationship at a time it wasn't in crisis, and for a country that wasn't an ally. The previous Bush administration did as well. One of those areas that there's been remarkable progress on, considering that less than 2 decades ago there were US sanctions on India, has been defense and security cooperation. Where do you see progress being possible on that front? What are you expecting, particularly related to this visit? And what are some of the challenges ahead, if you could drill down deeper in terms of the defense and security cooperation in the relationship?
Sure. Thanks, Tanvi. It's good to be back here at Brookings. Before I talk about defense cooperation and defense trade specifically, I think it's important to set the stage for the leaders' conversation about the regional environment, just to build on what Ambassador Rao said and what Jamie said. Ambassador Rao mentioned that a key shared goal when the two leaders meet is some measure of rapport building, and I think that's exactly right. Jamie mentioned that one of the goals is to signal, in a sense, that the U.S.-India relationship remains, for lack of a better word, special. That it's not the Montenegrin leader visiting the United States, it's something much more substantial and important to our shared interests. I think there's a third objective that both leaders probably have, which is to do a measure of shaping the other's view of the regional environment. And this is, I think, both important and timely because, as Jamie alluded to this new administration's views of South Asia, of Asia at large, are still relatively unformed and are still taking shape. So if I were Prime Minister Modi in particular, I think there would be a couple of issues in which I would want to see clarity, but also press to impart a particular viewpoint. And both of these were mentioned, but I just want to tease them out very briefly because I think they form a foundation in some ways for the kinds of cooperation that we do together. The first is on Pakistan. I think India was hopeful when Trump was elected that this new administration would take a more hawkish line on Pakistan. And that remains to be seen, but I think they may get half a loaf in this regard. The most recent signals are that the Trump administration might take a tougher rhetorical line, might take a tougher public posture, and indeed might seek to exert some U.S. leverage over Pakistan to deal with certain counterterrorism issues. But I think if you're Prime Minister Modi, you might see that, you might appreciate it, you might try to even encourage that. But there's an outstanding question as to whether that U.S. leverage would be exerted only against those groups that are Afghanistan-focused, groups like the Haqqani Network, or whether the United States really retains and deepens a commitment to deal with the militant groups that most directly threaten India, groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. And there, I think it's still an open question. There's been very little public discussion on that point. And that's one where even if the Prime Minister doesn't get clarity, I think there's an interest in trying to shape this administration's views of that problem set for if and when a crisis emerges between India and Pakistan, which I won't say is inevitable, but is not unlikely in the next 4 years. So I think that's one area where it's actually a very timely moment for both sides to be trying to sort of shape each other's view, and particularly on Pakistan. Second area, as Jamie mentioned, is the question of U.S. policy toward China, which I think is in a sort of unsustainable moment right now, and has yet to be settled. And in particular, I think the Indians and many here in Washington share an anxiety, not just about India's rise, China's rise, not just about North Korea, but about the ways in which Chinese investment in South Asia and Southeast Asia could make it difficult for a number of countries, particularly some of the small littoral countries, to have an independent foreign policy, could constrain their freedom of action. Countries from Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and others in Southeast Asia. And this is a real concern. It's a strategic concern. I know it's one that's felt in New Delhi. And I think this is an important moment in the context of what China's doing with Belt and Road, to see where there's a sort of foundational strategic alignment in what concerns we share, what we might do about it, cooperatively or perhaps with the Japanese or other partners that can bring resources to bear. So those are sort of some framing conversations that I think are likely to take place and that are important in sort of setting the groundwork for our defense cooperation. When it comes to the substance of our defense cooperation, I very much agree that we're in a good place. I'm proud of the work that I did and that many of the Obama administration did and the Bush administration before it to sort of slowly and steadily build up a regular tempo of engagements. And I would describe our defense cooperation with India as a low velocity, high inertia sort of relationship. So things move slowly, but they move today with enough mass and therefore momentum that they're likely to continue in a positive way unless the ground sort of shifts beneath the relationship. And that's a good thing. When we in the Obama White House developed the idea of major defense partner status in consultation with our Indian colleagues, it was really for three reasons. The first was to recognize where the relationship had come to. The fact that we do now privilege technology transfer to India in a way that is comparable to our closest allies. The volume of our defense sales, the kinds of sensitive cooperation we're doing in the defense trade space. So it was, in the first instance, a recognition. I think it was in the second instance a recognition that granted India some specific benefits that are still playing out. But third, and I think this is underappreciated, major defense partner status and our decision to pursue that together was recognized on both sides as a way of institutionalizing the defense relationship and ensuring that both the Indian bureaucracy and the U.S. bureaucracy would continue to provide each other the kind of preferential treatment that we had built up to, recognizing that we can't expect that this relationship will continue to be the high priority that it was, under the previous two administrations. So that, I think, has laid the groundwork such that even with the uncertainty on Pakistan and Afghanistan and China and the regional environment, there's enough momentum here that we see positive things happening with the Malabar exercise, with deepening conversations about issues that a few years ago would have been very sensitive. Aircraft carriers, anti-submarine warfare, many things in the maritime and information sharing domain that are moving along quite well. What should we watch for in the defense cooperation space? I think that any leader coming to meet President Trump has to have the mantra that whether or not they're going to be helpful to the United States, they should try to appear helpful to the United States. And I expect that Modi will do this in a somewhat different way than other world leaders have. But there are some ways where India can, at a minimum, appear helpful. One is on Afghanistan, the provision of equipment or some of the less sensitive kinds of training in the security sector, policing and the like in Afghanistan. The second is with a wider frame, thinking about terrorism and the counter-ISIL campaign. I don't know that India is interested in joining the coalition as such, but both India and the United States share a deep interest in border security, in making sure that terrorists can't travel transnationally, And I know that from my experience with US-India CT dialogues, the Indians know that they have a lot to learn from the ways in which the United States responded after 9/11 to protect ourselves and our borders, and then to begin sharing that information with global partners. So I think there's a lot of space there to cooperate. And then third, although this has a longer horizon, thinking about what India can do to be a burden-sharing partner in the Indian Ocean without making the kinds of obligations that would make it uncomfortable. The United States does not ask India to be an ally. We don't ask them to do our work for them, as they wouldn't ask them to do their work for them. And at the same time, I think there's a way to say that the deepening India's defense base, the U.S. support to India deepening its defense base over the long arc will make it such that the United States doesn't have to invest as much in the Indian Ocean, doesn't have to play as much of a role in protecting some of the common goods in the Indian Ocean. And that's the sort of argument that I think Prime Minister Modi and other world leaders are going to try to find when they come to meet the president. Third and finally, I would say on defense trade, this is also a good story. And I think this is a moment to recognize how far we've come. You know, Tanvi mentioned not many years back there were a welter of U.S. sanctions on India, and today we're in a space where there are billions of dollars of deals happening in defense and energy and elsewhere. But I think our expectations for this visit should be relatively modest for two reasons. One is that the Indian government is generally rather cautious about announcing specific defense deals in conjunction with U.S. visits. Now they may recognize that Trump is a different animal and may want to drill down into specific issues, and they have to be ready for that. But all of the same, I think there's a trend there to consider. But also that these deals often are long gestation. They take a long time in our system. They take a long time in the Indian system. The large deal that's probably closest to the horizon is the Guardian UAV deal. We'll see if we hear anything about that. But some of the other major defense platforms that have been talked about either have to wind their way through a U.S. process or through a new Indian process, like the new strategic partnership model, which finally emerged. That 17-page policy chapter finally emerged after a year and is providing more guidance and I think more opportunity space for American companies to partner in a structured way on major tenders in India. So all that to say, I think we're in a good place. I'm proud of what we've done, and I think that this new administration has a lot of good material to carry forward, and that on the defense and security side, we have put in place over the years together an architecture that is likely to keep things moving in the right direction. Where I think this visit, and this is to circle around, I think to your point, Jamie, I think where this visit is really critical, apart from rapport building, is in revalidating some of the geopolitical foundations of our cooperation. It's one thing for our companies to sell equipment, for our companies to cooperate, for us to do technology transfer, for us to do exercises. But I do think there's a sense here in Washington and in Delhi that we want to make sure we're on the same page in two areas in particular. One is our view of the global terrorist challenge, from the global stage, ISIL, to Afghanistan, to Pakistan. Do we have a convergent view of the terrorist challenge and the tools that we have to deal with it? And second is, do we have a convergent view about the ways in which we want to try to shape the emerging balance of power in Asia, particularly the rise of China, and even more particularly, China's activities in the Indian Ocean region, which have a direct bearing on India's sense of security. I think with greater fidelity on those two sort of geopolitical questions, that's the best thing that this visit can do to facilitate practical defense partnership.
Thanks, Josh. It sounds like you're arguing for Prime Minister Modi or saying that he'll do the "help me help you" line to President Trump. Rick, you've worked on the part of the relationship that many have considered kind of the other kind of key driver, if not even more important in some ways than the strategic part of the relationship. Arguably, those two, as well as kind of the value side, have been equal drivers. But Without the kind of economic ballast, it's likely that this relationship wouldn't be where it is today. It involves, perhaps to a greater degree than the strategic side of the relationship, all the anchors that Ambassador Rao talked about, states, these days even cities perhaps, but also Congress and the private sector. Having said that, as people have discussed, the Trump administration in India, those have also been, trade and investment ties have been one of the areas that have come up as potential areas of differences, even as FDI in India increases, et cetera, and trade has increased, but stalled a bit in terms of growth. How do you see this playing out over the next few years? And where do you see challenges? Where do you see opportunities?
Yeah. Well, in one word to sum it up, I'm nervous. And to expand that to an entire line, I think looking at this trip, you've got the leader of the world's wealthiest country expecting the leader of one of the world's developing countries to come here and give us benefits and gifts. I mean, that's what we're on the cusp of right now. Come to my country and give me trade concessions. And so I think that's a really tough mix to kind of begin with, but really sort of unpack. When we talk about economic ties between our countries, there's two different ways that we can look at it. You know, the first is business to market, right? What are companies actually doing in practice? And the second is government to government. And they're two very, very different stories. On the business to market side, you know, what are companies actually doing right now, and how does that impact, which, by the way, is way more important than government to government ties in people's real life, right? Investment in trade, that's jobs, that's money, that's livelihoods. So, you know, luckily, that's probably the better side of the story right now. On the business to market side in terms of the relationship. You know, you've actually seen in the last 12 months about $44.5 billion of fresh equity investment, foreign direct investment into India. That's not reinvested earnings and other things. That's fresh equity for building plant power and equipment. And that's up about almost 10% over the prior 12 months. So it's been growing pretty steadily under the Modi administration. U.S.-India goods trade is up just a hair underneath $70 billion. It had been stalled for a couple of years, but starting to take off again. That's up almost 5% from the prior 12 months. Still, you know, a 2-to-1 trade balance in India's favor in goods trade, but still you do see a lot of ballast in terms of what companies are doing to support the relationship on the economic front. The third that I oftentimes take a look at is foreign portfolio investment. If you're familiar with what that is, if you have a retirement account and you invest in the Morgan Stanley Emerging Markets Fund, and Morgan Stanley then parks that money in key markets, you actually see a lot more portfolio investment going to India again. That had stalled out. You know, the first year of the Modi administration, India hit an all-time record. Then it dropped out. It was actually negative in year 2. There was more money coming out of Indian markets from foreign investors than going in. But that started to take off again. It's about $14 billion in the last 12 months. So on all three, the three primary that I look at, foreign investment, foreign portfolio investment, and trade, goods trade, you actually see pretty good ballast right now. So that's the positive side of the narrative. But that being said, those very same companies, in both directions, have, I think, an increased number of grievances. There's some old ones on the U.S. side. You know, we think that India should have a different patent regime, or we think that there's certain segments that are closed off. And I'm not here to argue in favor of anybody's position in these kind of things, but there's large groups of American companies that feel very strongly, and they feel that they've got a better champion in office now to take up those issues than they've had in recent years. Indian companies as well. You know, we've got a couple of things taking place right now in terms of, you know, are there going to be limitations in H-1Bs? Is there concerns about the countries with which the U.S. has large trade deficit? I mean, India, we may not consider trade with India to be large in the overall picture, but actually they cracked the top 10. India's our number 9 goods trading partner now, and one of our 10 largest trade deficits. So they're under that scanner. So, you know, the companies that see grievances in India there is an expansion of price controls. You know, you've seen it with some medical devices recently and things like that. You know, there is an expansion of compulsory local manufacturing rules. The cabinet just a couple of weeks ago passed a new rule where for government procurement there has to be local content. So, you know, the companies that look at maybe having a little bit less access to the market, you know, they're going to feel that the administration is definitely going to be their champion, because these are the kind of things that the Trump administration has been talking about in areas where they feel that we don't have, you know, great market access. I mean, over 20 years, I mean, India has been pure play, opening more and more all the time, but there still are areas where you see these kind of frictions. So the numbers are good, but there are grievances on both sides, and I think those are going to paint. Now, from the government to government standpoint, that's where I get a whole lot more nervous. I think, the investment treaty, for instance, 9 years ago, right, we announced our intention, these are the last year of the Bush administration, to negotiate an investment treaty. And today, 9 years later, we're further apart than the day we began. The U.S. made some slight amendments to our model. India made deeper amendments to its model treaty. And so today we're further apart, and you don't even hear it mentioned anymore. So in terms of some kind of big economic issue that could tie us together, we're not part of the same trading blocs. We're on absolute opposite ends of talks at the WTO, and even our attempts to cobble something together on a bilateral status, hasn't been able to move in recent years. So there's no big picture thing that's been tying us together for economic, and instead, we've been kind of subsisting on smaller and substantive issues. There has been some increased attention on state-to-state engagement, and energy obviously has been such a big underpinning for the Obama administration's engagement with India. Modi, I think there's no part of the economy that Modi has moved further ahead from where I think Indian voters are than the kind of commitments that he's made on climate change. 175 gigs of renewables. For India to put that on paper, far beyond any Paris commitment. They probably will fall short of the 175 gigs by 2022, but they're making a good go at it, and that's expensive, and people aren't ready to pay that price for So, on the energy side, I think you had probably one high-level issue that recently tied us together, but I don't think anybody would claim that's going to be a main driver in the years coming ahead. So government to government, I'm actually quite nervous. I think the initial signals you've seen from the Trump administration on, they're doing a review of immigration policy, specifically noting H-1B visas. They're looking at the countries with which the U.S. has a large trade deficit and looking if there's measures the United States should be taking. So we'll see those things. Of course, the results of those studies won't come out until after the visit, I hope. I hope we don't have some kind of big announcement on trade remedies on India in the next 2 days or something like that. That would certainly paint things a little bit differently, but don't put it past the U.S. once in a while to one hand moving in a different direction than the other hand or something like that. I do think that the government to government side, I think we're in for a rocky period. There's no big picture issue either on the multilateral scene or bilateral to tie us together. These grievances that are out there, companies are sharpening their knives and they're saying, now is the time I can get my government to be a powerful advocate. And on both sides, you see an increase in friction. So I hope that what Josh had talked about on the strategic front. I think in the Obama administration, both for the real progress on defense ties and Modi as a partner on global energy issues and climate change, we were able to ignore, for the large measure, these small grievances. The energy is off, and the defense side, are we going to ask for practical cooperation in a deeper way than we've seen in recent years? And if we ask for that and India's not ready to deliver, then we may not see quite as much momentum as we saw on the defense side. So, absent those big picture things, these minor grievances on trade could become a lot more prickly. People talk about if we lose the narrative on the strategic side and you've got all these minor grievances, maybe we'll just be in cruise control for a little while. But I just look back to a few years ago, the end of 2013. We lost the narrative on the strategic issues. We had a small number of grievances on trade that were blown out of proportion. The arrest of a diplomat, and suddenly both sides seemed very happy. I know it's not exactly true in practice, but by and large, the relationship really fell apart because of a small number of steps that took place in quick succession. Some unrelated things like downgrading India's airports authority and things like that. So I think that hopefully what Josh had brought up, I hope it's on point because the reasons are still there, and the cooperation that the groundwork that's been laid is very important. And I think having something big like the defense and security relationship to make sure these trade grievances don't get us off course is going to be pretty important at this point. So I'll leave it at that and happy to take any questions. Thanks, Tanvi.
Thanks, Rick. It's interesting that what was interesting not just was the kind of 2013, the kind of bad year in U.S.-India relations, in some ways a strained year, but to me what was also interesting is how quickly the two countries bounced back from that, recognizing the structural imperatives for the relationship, and how you saw from kind of that one summer of 2013 to the one summer of 2014, it didn't just have to do with the change in government, that there were these drivers. And so, is there that capacity to recover? I'd say the one issue in energy where you might see, I think we won't hear the term climate change, we might hear clean energy, but I'd say LNG. That's one area if they can get the pricing right. We've all mentioned kind of this idea of transactionalism in various forms, the need for tweetable wins, so to speak. And there have been a couple of recent kind of private sector deals that have been announced over the last few months that could possibly be repackaged and announced in a tweet at least. But just drilling down on some of these kind of transactions, if you want to think about them that way, or agreements that are possible. Ambassador Rao, you mentioned India doing more in Afghanistan and the Gulf potentially. Could you drill down on that a little, and what could India do? And Josh, if you could talk about what, you mentioned it as well, what the US would like to see India do more in Afghanistan, or for example, for that matter, in the Middle East.
Well, I think on Afghanistan, when you speak of drilling down, I think the new Trump administration and Mr. Modi's government really need to sit down and have a heart-to-heart talk about not only how they view the emerging situation, but what their plans are for the next 4 to 5 years in terms of not only contributing to stability in Afghanistan, that's in terms of governance and better management of the internal situation, not from our point of view, but for the Afghans themselves, as well as improving the capacity of the Afghan establishment, the security establishment, and the defense establishment to deal with threats within the country. And I think in terms of political reconciliation within Afghanistan, I know that India has had a position, has had a point of view about the involvement of the Taliban and the integration of Taliban elements into the administration. Perhaps, we will have to see when you examine the situation further whether India is prepared to take a more holistic view of how we integrate these elements into, an administration within Afghanistan that helps contribute to better stability within the country. I think India's involvement in Afghanistan is a almost permanent fixture now in terms of what it contributes to development in that country, and just in terms of all the ties that have been built up, particularly since 2002. I don't think any government in India would like to sacrifice on those gains. So it's important, I think, for us to focus more closely on this situation. What is the US plan? If it means more troop deployments, it doesn't amount to very much in terms of augmentation of numbers. But is there something beyond that? What is the view beyond that? So I think there's much more need for clarity and higher resolution when it comes to how we deal as India as a near neighbor of Afghanistan, and India and the US as a country that has obviously very definite stakes in the region. How we're going to, how India can be, can contribute more. We'll have to see what the Americans have in mind when they talk, and they've always spoken of, India being able to, not so much in Afghanistan, but in terms of the region as a whole, how India can be more active and perhaps less risk averse. Mm-hmm. But we'll have to see how that really is defined in terms of what Afghanistan looks like for both countries. In terms of the Gulf, I think India has very, very real stakes in what happens in the Gulf. I'm just not talking of the Saudi, Qatari, imbroglios that you see now. But in terms of our energy security, what we get from the Gulf, the large presence of the Indian diaspora, Indian workers in all the countries in the Gulf, across any divides that there may be. In terms of Iran, Mr. Trump has been not just tweeting, but also the signals don't look very good on Iran and how the new administration regards the nuclear deal. What implications does that have, for instance, India's plans to develop the Chabahar port in Iran, and our desire to get more access in terms of connectivity into Afghanistan, given the Pakistani attitude about India's involvement. So all this, I think, what happens if the US imposes fresh sanctions on Iran? What happens to projects like Chabahar? Where does it leave India? I mean, it would be a body blow to India's aspirations for that connectivity, and just to be able to, in terms of OBOR, one of the speakers mentioned OBOR. It's not only connectivity, but also, where India and the US can align their interests better in terms of not only addressing the issues emerging from China's rise in the region, and also the network of communication and the presence that China is building up in the region. How does that affect our own, the balance of power as we see it, as also, where do our views converge? I know that recently there's been talk of revival of the New Silk Road initiative and helping to build better connectivity between India, that is South Asia and Southeast Asia, and the US, being much more affirmative on these issues. That may provide an opening. So I think the possibilities as they exist are enormous, and that leads me back to the central premise that I've made. This relationship between India and the US is in a good place. And, Mr. Trump is essentially, to use a cricketing term, starting off on a good wicket. Yeah.
Josh, you can use baseball terms.
I think India has been helpful in Afghanistan. That's been recognized. India has made significant investments in economic development. India has ties to a whole class of political leaders and has played a constructive role. At the same time, I think that there would be value for India, especially with respect to this new administration, in saying we want to be even more helpful in Afghanistan. And it doesn't have to be in new and different ways, but I suspect that NATO is likely to disappoint President Trump in stepping up to the plate and providing substantially more troops or substantially more funding. And I was involved in the last funding rounds on both the defense side and the civilian assistance side over the last couple of years. And I can say it's getting much more difficult given the array of global problems that we all face, to get funding for Afghanistan, for the security forces and for economic assistance. And I think that it's going to be hard to rally Europe in a very substantial way. So in some ways, India has the ability to say, regardless of what others are doing in this space, we've been an economic partner and we want to continue to be. There are also some things that they've been doing on the defense provision side that I think are helpful. It used to be, there was a time when the United States strongly advised India not to do anything related to security in Afghanistan, not to provide equipment, not to do any kind of trainings. And that was for fear that even Indian presence or the perception of Indian activity in Afghanistan would feed Pakistan's neuralgia about Indian activities and Indian influence in Afghanistan. Around 2013, there was an inflection point inside the US government where I think people began to be more open in our conversations with India, recognizing that India had largely been self-deterred, not deterred by us, but recognizing that it wasn't in their own interest to do things that seemed provocative, right? And I think India is still in that position, and that there are things that it can do in providing helpful equipment and providing some non-sensitive training that would demonstrate that they're trying to be helpful, that would actually be helpful in this environment where what I think this administration is trying to do on Afghanistan has as much to do with political engagement, with training and capacity building with the security services as it does with troop numbers or anything else. So I think India does have a place there. And I would also say one of the things that has been a really positive trend line between the United States and India is that our consultations on the region have become much more substantive and much more candid. Our conversations on Afghanistan, for example, even though India has not been part of the Taliban reconciliation groups like the QCG, there have been very close consultations with India. There have been closer consultations on Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and sort of the regional issues where India used to be quite defensive about any conversation the United States would have about those countries. So there's a trend line where that this new administration can pick up in its own way with its own discourse, and it'll rename every dialogue we have, and as well it should, but it can pick up the substance of those conversations, which you don't see in the public domain, but have deepened substantially below the surface. And I think that's a space where India can say, we want to do more, we want to consult more, we want to be helpful where we can, and they have some opportunities to do that.
Thanks, Josh. I had questions for Jamie and Rick, but in the interest of kind of getting as many audience questions in, I'm going to take audience questions first and in clusters so that we get in as many as possible. We'll take the two here and then the one there. If you could please identify yourself and then keep your questions short so that we can get in as many as possible.
Yeah, sure. David Bryden with Results. Wanted to see if any of the panelists could reflect on U.S.-India cooperation on global health security. Secretary Price raised that in a cabinet meeting recently and talked about how proud he is to work on that. But on the India side, we still see India preferring to rely on Global Fund and the Gates Foundation to finance its program on tuberculosis. Regardless of how serious that epidemic is and and the global health implications. I just met a 6-year-old in Baltimore who had XDR TB, which is the worst form you can have, Indian-born child. Fortunately, I think she's going to be okay now, thanks to physicians in Baltimore. But it's an area where India's own investment in addressing this massive epidemic is really quite pathetic. And that's called a task in today's New York Times.
Question back there.
Hi, my name is Contessa Bourbon from the New York Times. I'd like to ask Richard and the Ambassador and the other panelists, what sector should be liberalized or be open in India so U.S. investors could increase their investments? That should be a possible discussion with Mr. Modi and President Trump. And how big are Indian investments in the U.S.? Thank you.
And the question over here.
Ambassador, my name is Dee. I'm Indian. I was born in this country, and I'm a lawyer. I thought it'd be interesting if you tell the audience the beautiful, beautiful hotels that Donald Trump has, the Taj Mahal Motel, and why that wouldn't be a conflict of interest in this relationship. Why wouldn't that be a conflict of interest?
Do we have we'll take that one back there so that and then we'll go to the panelist.
Yeah, hi, I'm Shweta, and Shweta Ramachandran, currently a student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. So my question is about India's deepening ties with Russia. Actually, this is in light of Arun Jaitley, who is the defense minister, and his recent visit to Russia. And there were deals which were finalized almost worth 10 billion, and there were reports which came out which said that India might get its second nuclear submarine from Russia. So I'm pretty curious to know whether India's deepening ties with Russia will sort of be of concern to the Trump administration, and would the Trump administration in some sense also be expecting India's loyalty in that sense, or where do you see this going?
Great, thank you. We'll start maybe with Rick. Do you want to take the question about economics and any of the others?
Yeah. Actually, there aren't so many sectors in India anymore that still have FDI limitations. So the answer, I can almost kind of run through the ones that are left there. I think the one sector that the U.S. kind of pushes for, probably the most active these days, is on retail. India has absolutely shattered the model where they have different regulatory regimes if you're selling from business to business, business to consumer, online, offline, wholesale, retail, duty-free stores. There's 1,000 different regimes. I'd love for my own sanity to consolidate those, because it all is about selling something to somebody. But I understand the restrictions there. But some of the areas still are barred. There really isn't an opening for multi-brand retail. Not that I think there's a lot of companies from around the world that would go in. It's not just Walmart, but Metro and others. But the ones that would go in would come in with pretty substantial resources. And services jobs of those sort, I think, would take off pretty quickly. Insurance, they made a slight increase to 49% FDI. But they inserted this poison pill, which robbed foreign companies, which previously had been able to exert management authority from being able to exert that. So a lot of companies haven't went in at 49. So retail, insurance, law firms, foreign law firms are still barred from practicing there. So there's still a few areas where there are limitations. So, basic answer is there's only a few sectors left, and so those are the ones I'd like to see opened up. I'll touch briefly on the Russia bit there. I mean, my perception is, I think with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with Russia's deepening military ties, India's re-engagement, I think the United States largely has been trying not to make that really a proof point in the relationship because, for us, it's about getting better access to a huge market. It's about strengthening a counterweight in Asia to China. And so we've I think, been a little bit more comfortable, that probably is too strong of a word, but not trying to press the issues on Russia and even India's other relationships that may make us uncomfortable. So I think so far so good as long as the East Asia focus that we've been really engaging for has been on the table. If we lose the narrative on East Asia, then maybe some of these other relationships I think would become points of a little bit more tension.
Jamie, the Modi government and India more broadly was one of the few countries that during the campaign was looking forward to kind of the rapprochement with Russia that they thought was coming. It hasn't come, and especially on the Hill, there's the sentiment on Russia has kind of deteriorated. How is this likely to play a role? Has it affected the relationship?
I agree with Rick. I think from the White House perspective, I doubt that there will be a lot of focus on Russia in this visit. I do think India runs the risk over the long run, though, because I do think we're headed in a rather negative trajectory with Russia. Certainly, once we get beyond the investigations about what actually happened with the election, and then the attention in Congress and elsewhere turns to figuring out how we calibrate and how U.S.-Russian relations should be affected going forward, I think we're going to enter a period of rather negative U.S.-Russian relations for quite some time to come, given the likelihood that President Putin is not going to change his behavior. So I think it's a risk that India runs by continuing to focus on that, but I agree with Rick. I don't think it's going to become the test of the U.S.-India relationship. I'll just say one other thing quickly on Iran. I understand the concerns that India has about the evolution of this administration's Iran policy. I am somewhat optimistic, though, on that. I do think you're going to see a tougher line with Iran. We've already seen various rounds of sanctions from this administration. I don't know what they're going to do on the JCPOA, but even if they move towards an effort to try to renegotiate the JCPOA and improve elements of it, I just don't see us as a country returning to the same approach that we had prior to the nuclear negotiations of basically chasing after every deal, going country by country around the world and trying to shut down every piece of economic engagement with Iran. So I just think the approach from this administration is probably going to be more calibrated, more targeted, to exert pressure to hopefully fix some elements of the deal that this administration feels are not in our interest in the long run. And so while I'm sure there's going to be a lot of sensitivity to that in India, I think there are probably ways to manage that in the bilateral relationship.
Josh?
Yeah, I just want to add on the Russia point. I think India's relationship with Russia, we also have to look at it in the regional context in which Russia is flirting with Pakistan. I think it's only flirtation, but flirting about deeper defense cooperation, in which Russia is playing a more explicitly malign role in Afghanistan through funding and engagement with the Taliban, so it seems. So in those environments, India is, I think, increasingly suspicious of Russian activities in its immediate neighborhood, which could, over the long run, temper some aspects of that cooperation. I also want to say, sir, to your point on global health security, I mean, this is an issue that has bipartisan support in this town for being a problem that we have to deal with together. And it was one that President Obama felt very strongly about. And I remember over lunch, President Obama raised this issue with Prime Minister Modi and really raised some of the frustrations that the United States had about India's unwillingness to participate in the global regime that was trying to deal with this problem. And this was quite frustrating to the president. And I'm paraphrasing, but Prime Minister Modi essentially said, I hear you, but we just don't do it that way. and there's a reticence on the part of India to be engaged even in sort of a multilateral setting where there are voluntary commitments, and I think they had some bureaucratic reservations. Now, the good news is that in this new administration, we don't really do it that way either. There's a bias toward bilateralism, right? The bad news, and so there may be some space to do some things bilaterally. The bad news is that global health security is not a problem set that's well suited to bilateral interactions because diseases don't respect those kinds of boundaries, and there has to be a sort of a wider look at this. So I think that's an issue that we're going to face in a number of domains, from trade to others, when you try to say we have skepticism about multilateral frameworks. We want to move bilaterally. You face problems of bandwidth, and you face problems where the challenges you're dealing with are not always well suited to those sort of narrow bilateral channels, and health security may be one of those.
Ambassador Brown,
Yeah.
did you want to address any?
Well, I basically agree with what has been said by the other panelists. I think as far as this visit is concerned, I really don't know if there will be much focus on some of these particular issues that have been mentioned, but certainly I assume that there will be a continuing dialogue between the two administrations on all these areas of cooperation that have been established over the last few years, and that includes health too. And there's health, science and technology, energy, space, you name it. So it's a multifaceted relationship. As far as Russia is concerned, I think anybody standing in South Asia today, or especially in India, would understand the need for India also to be looking at multiple alignments, given its own security situation and given this long-standing relationship that it has had with Russia. I'm not just talking of the Soviet Union, but post-Soviet Union's disintegration. We have maintained a steady dialogue and cooperation with Russia. So it's not one swallow making a summer kind of situation. It's been there for a long time, and I think the United States understands the context in which this cooperation takes place. So that's basically what I'd like to say, and I think the others have addressed the questions.
So we're going to take a very quick round. We've got the 3 questions there. I'm not going to get to all of them, sorry, but we'll take this question here and that question from the lady in the middle.
My name is Elliot Hurwitz. I'm a former State Department, World Bank, and Intelligence Committee person. I appreciate the panel's presentation. It was very good. I just wanted to ask Mr. White. He said that NATO is likely to disappoint Trump. I believe that Trump has already disappointed NATO. So I appreciate any comments on that point.
So Ray Vickford from the Wilson Center. In terms of tweetable deals and jobs, America First, Make in India. Josh has mentioned Guardian drones. What about F-16s and the New Deal, evidently, or agreement with Tata and Lockheed on that? How does that fit with all that?
And then back there.
Julia Eckelman with the State Department. I have a question probably for Josh, but anyone else who wants to chime in. In the context of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, where do you see potential for cooperation on nuclear security? And where do you see support for India's bid for the NSG going, if any? Thank you.
Josh, do you want to start?
Sure. So on NATO, I think you're right in the sense that NATO seems frustrated by this new administration's approach to their own security and to the alliance commitments. And I think that some of that frustration is probably one factor, not the only factor, but one factor in making them reticent to commit to the expeditionary mission, which has been a very significant but very anomalous mission for NATO in Afghanistan. And I think that if they felt somewhat more reassured about America's commitment to to Europe, they would be a bit more willing to extend themselves in Afghanistan. But again, there are other sort of wider questions about the global array of problems that the United States and our NATO allies are having to deal with, and the fact that Afghanistan is enormously expensive, and that those resources could go elsewhere. So I think there are a number of issues in play, not just the current state of the relationship between the president and NATO. The question of F-16s, this has been in the news, and it's not entirely unexpected that Lockheed would announce this tie-up with Tata. And to be clear, this is not a deal being consummated. This is their marketing pitch for them to get the deal. And there will still be a competition that happens for the single-engine fighter that happens under this brand new rubric that the Indian government has put out as a way to try to engage private sector Indian defense firms and not just the large, lumbering, largely ineffective public sector undertakings. So this is going to take a while to play out. I mean, I do think it's notable that the Obama administration made that F-16 or approved that F-16 offer to begin with. It's something that wouldn't have happened several years ago, given the sensitivities with Pakistan having the F-16 as a critical part of its defense platforms. So I think that was a significant step and a recognition of where the U.S.-India relationship has come. There seems to be a little bit of uncertainty about whether you can reconcile America first and American jobs first with moving a production line to India. And I do think there's a good logic for this that fits together. The production line likely would be closed. It sustains potentially a lot of jobs in the United States on the engineering side. So there is a case to be made that this would be valuable. And I think there's a case to be made for India as well, that they would be buying into not just the latest widget, although the new Block 70 is quite impressive, but they'd be buying into a plan to integrate themselves in with the global supply chain. And in my interactions over the years with Indian defense officials and firms, there tends to be an obsession with the bright, shiny object of a particular widget, particular defense technology, and less concern for, hey, how do we integrate ourselves into a global defense marketplace that is increasingly global, where pieces of planes are being assembled all over the world from companies all over the world. That's the game that India needs to get in. And that, I think, is the comparative advantage that the F-16 joint venture would put forward. Briefly on the nuclear question, nuclear security has been a very sensitive subject between the United States and India. And I think India is rather defensive about its nuclear security record, especially in the civilian domain, and has responded negatively to some of the nonprofit reports and others that have come out that have poked some criticism. And here, I think there is space for India to improve, candidly. Pakistan has improved quite a lot because it knew that it was under the microscope, and it knew that it faced serious internal threats because of the extremist environment. And they've taken a lot of steps, not perfectly, but a lot of steps to deal with that. So I do think there's a bit more that India can do. I'm not sure how cooperatively it will want to do it. I think it will probably focus on doing it by itself and internally, but those are good discussions to have. It's important to talk about the ways in which the things that India is doing, the things that its neighbors are doing, change the environment for regional safety and security on nuclear issues. And finally, on the NSG, we made a strong push for this at the White House to support India's membership. My feeling is that this is not an independent variable in India-China relations so much as a dependent variable. So when those relations are bad for other reasons, which they are now, it's much less likely that this happens because the NSG is a consensus organization. At the end of the day, China has to agree under some framework. So I'm not optimistic in the near term, but I do think that a lot of the groundwork that was laid, a lot of the thinking and months of consultations will eventually circle around again, some of those products and consultations in providing a pathway eventually for India. I just don't see it happening in the next few months.
Master Val, Rick, can you?
I think we've addressed all the issues.
Jamie, I want to end with a question to you about one of the anchors in the relationship. I mean, we've often heard it said on both sides that there's bipartisan support for the relationship. And we've particularly seen that on the Hill. You mentioned particularly kind of engaging a younger generation of kind of policy entrepreneurs, for want of a better term, on both sides. But in terms of the Hill, what more would you like to see? We saw a couple of congressional delegations go out in the last two recesses, but what would you like to see? What do you think can be done more in terms of congressional engagement, or whether it's a legislative more of legislative connection between the two legislatures? What do you think is possible on that sphere, in that sphere?
No, I think you're right. The congressional views of India have been an anchor in the relationship, and I actually think it's a very positive story. So I don't know that a lot more needs to be done. I think, as with any U.S. partnership with another democracy, the more exchanges, especially between parliamentarians, the better. And so that might be one area to try to just get members of Congress both over to India, but also their Indian counterparts here, and I'm sure a lot of that already happens, but to maybe regularize that a little bit more. Because the thing that strikes me about this relationship is it's a really, it's just of utmost long-term strategic importance. And the one danger, we were asked about tweetable deals or just kind of the NATO debate, the real concern I have about this administration is I think they're very much focused in the moment. And America First is about delivering immediately to the president's voters. And I think there are things that they can highlight from this partnership that will be in the moment, but the real play is long-term. And so I think this will fundamentally, as we see their India policy evolve, be a broader question about what America First is about and whether there's a long-term strategic horizon to an America First foreign policy. Because if they're willing to have a long-term perspective, I think there are real opportunities. But I think that's to be determined at this point.
To be determined is a good note on which to end this panel. We're going to go straight into the next panel on Prime Minister Modi's visit to Israel in early July. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists.